Okay, I'm reading today chapter 13, and this is on the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, and the book is entitled The Memoirs of Princess Alice, the Duchess of Gloucester. There's 13, I'm on chapter 13 out of 29. They're very short chapters. We only have about 50 pages, so that's all that's left in the book, but it's a very good story when you read the life of Alice, who came from a noble family that descended from Charles II, his firstborn illegitimate child. It's a very, very interesting. I would read this again, and I've already read this 2 times, and I'm not one for reading books 2 times. But this story, her story is fascinating. Her time in Australia, and some of her experience there, her time in Africa, her experiences in Africa right before she married Henry. But they really prepared her for her being the Duchess when Henry was in Australia, because they had some primitive primitive conditions. She's fighting off all kinds of little animals, vermins. Um, she's fighting off rats, sand fleas, everything. I mean, but she really enjoyed her time over in Africa, in Australia, and she writes a wonderful farewell speech to everyone. And it's a place where William and Richard's first few years were spent, and it holds a very special place because her boys were so little, and that was literally their first home. So I'm going to go on and read about it, but I want to highlight that this right here is David, and then this is Bertie, and this is Henry, and this is George, and then this is John, who had epilepsy, and this is their sister Mary. And this right here is Henry. He is the middle. He truly is the middle child. And when David abdicated, um, it prompted Henry into a position of supporting his other brother, who was not expected to be the king, who was bashful, who had the stuttering. Bertie had a stutter. He was not very confident as the king, and so he uh, was promoted into the next brother of supporting him. And just to show you later on, like, he's actually a very handsome young man. That picture here, he looks like Prince, looks a lot like him. He was destined for a military career. Okay, so here he is, Duke of Gloucester in 1915. He was training for a military career, and he was one of the more athletic ones. And yeah, you can see here, this is the three brothers. Look on that a little bit. This is Edward, and then this is George. He was very good looking. Him and David were very, very close. He was one of the smartest of the brothers, Prince George, but he had a very short, he had a short life, he died when his kids were young. Him and Marina were only married for 8 years, completely changed their life. He married a true princess in Princess Marina. So, yeah. But all of them really, and when you read David's story and his time, all of them were raised to help serve the people. And this is in the early 1900s, 1915, 1920. I mean, times were really tough for a lot of the English people and all around the world, and their job was to help the people, to help highlight these situations, in working places and poor people, and that was their job. But wanted to read here. He had a bit of a scandal, which I guess everybody's got a scandal. But when when David abdicated, as I said, prompted him to step up his position and support. He had to leave the military, and it was a very abrupt change for Prince Henry. So if you're able to read that, it's a very abrupt change to the carefree life up until that point, and it was made clear that the new king, on the first evening of his reign, if you two think now that I have taken this new job on, you can go on behaving just like you did in the same old way, then you're very much mistaken. You two have to pull yourself together, King George VI warned of his two younger brothers. Understandable, because they did, as all do, they had a wayward path, but after abdicating, George VI and Henry became very, very close. They were brought together closer. The king trusted Prince Henry with important matters, in which he dutifully undertook. Sometimes those were organized by the king. The king became a little irritated with him because he was not as systematic with his organization, but he really did well with marrying Alice, in my opinion. He did so well with marrying Alice. She was as Marina was, she was a good wife for Henry. Alice was a good fit and a good wife for Henry, as is Marina was for George, young Prince George at the time. So I want to just go ahead and start reading, Chapter 13. Almost the first thing I did on arriving back in England was to visit the fens, where, owing to melting snow, the banks of the canals, riddled by rat holes, had broken, causing enormous floods. There was mile upon mile of water, with nothing to see but the occasional roof sticking out. We traveled around this pathetic wilderness in an amphibious vehicle called the Duck. At Barnwell, everything was overgrown. Sheep on the lawns, potatoes in the rose gardens. In London, we moved back into the York House, which had been greatly damaged in the bombing. And to put all this right, it took a lot of time and effort. The York House being near Marlborough House, I often looked in on Queen Mary for dinner when my husband was out. I often looked in on Queen Mary. I would sit talking while she stitched away at a rug she was making, consisting of squares depicting different flowers. She enjoyed working on the flowers, but could not be bothered with the background, which was handed over for her lady-in-waiting to finish off. It was eventually bought by Canada in an aid to some charity. One of our annual expeditions was always to the British Industries Fair in Olympia. The organizers would always give lunch for the royal party, which was usually attended to by the Queen and various government mistresses. Queen Mary would lead the procession in a wheelchair, with everyone else trooping behind. It was quite an undertaking. We generally did 2 days of it, with her making endless purchases at wholesale prices from bazaars and Christmas presents. We kept a whole room of cupboard full of these, and I'm sure her activities have great pleasure to everyone there as well as to ourselves. Much the same was true of the antique dealers' fair. They used to open it up for the royal party after dinner, and Queen Mary would again head the cavalcade. She much enjoyed this also. In fact, she enjoyed all expeditions, even when she feared the worst. Bertie and George VI, King George VI, and Queen Elizabeth are coming to London on Monday, the 23rd, for the evening of the exhibition of the Victoria and Albert Museum. She wrote when I was in Australia, "I hope it will not be too hideous." Queen Mary would from time to time come to watch Annie Driver take the music and movements class at York House, a weekly event I had arranged for the boys so that they could meet other children their age. She was an exception to Mrs. Driver's rule that no onlookers should attend. This was typical of her interest in all matters concerning the family. In the autumn of 1947, we paid a state visit to Malta to inaugurate a new constitution, arriving back on the eve of the wedding of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. Our William was one of the pages, which gave us much happiness. Princess Elizabeth having been a bridesmaid, as she was a bridesmaid to us. Christmas was the usual carefree family affair at Sandringham, and shortly after, at the beginning of February, we flew out to inaugurate another constitution, this time in Ceylon. On the way, we stopped at Habbaniyah. The Air Force officer looking after us was embarrassed when he was about to see us off following the morning because he found his trousers had been stolen. Seeing the thief disappear down the street, he let off his pistol, but to no avail. We also stayed one night in Pakistan. I was much annoyed when somebody burst into our airplane shortly after we had touched down and sprayed us all, including my best hat, which I had just put on, with insecticide. The partition of India had only just taken place, and the visit could not have been made more of a difficult time. Mr. Jinnah, who was the Governor General, he was an old man, and as it turned out, he only had a few months to live. I sat next to him at dinner and soon noticed he was in a great state of agitation. Eventually, he could not contain himself any longer. He poured out all his woes and worries with great indignation. Lord Mountbatten seemed to be the chief villain in his mind. It's impossible not to feel sorry for him because he was so clearly upset, but there was nothing I could do about it. The Ceylonese Parliament was opened in a beautifully decorated hangar, but my most vivid memory of the visit is of a great torchlit procession of elephants and dancers through the streets of Kandy. The next day, I was invited to sit on the knee of a sacred elephant, which had carried the Buddha's tooth in the procession. Such an honor was rarely granted, and the old elephant could not have been more kindly or obliging. It had been decided that we should avoid Karachi on the flight home, but to our surprise, Mr. Jinnah insisted on asking us to dinner again. The second, much more private meal went far better than the first until the coffee arrived, when Mr. Jinnah again became angry and excitable about the iniquities of Lord Mountbatten and Britain in general. He harangued my husband on the subject till almost about 1 o'clock in the morning. Having run out of breath, he stormed out of the room without saying good night to any of us. In North Africa, we stopped to visit some of the recent battlefields. There was not much to remind one of. There was some trepidation about landmines, of which there was apparently still plenty lying around, blowing up occasional sheep. We arrived home on the 19th of February, having flown almost 13,000 miles during the 16 days of the tour. In the autumn of that year, we made an enjoyable visit to Denmark. This was to attend an Anglo-Danish exhibition, and it was the first by a member of our royal family since the accession of Frederick VIII, now known as Rico, to his family. He succeeded his father, Christian IX. Earlier in that year, we were particularly impressed by the manners and the good behavior of the little princesses, who courtesied to everyone, including my maid. We were taken by the king and the queen for a delightful trip in the royal yacht, visiting many places of interest and stopping for dinner one evening with the Dowager Queen. Finding it too difficult to arrange the seating for dinner, we had to draw names for our partner, which resulted in my sitting next to my lady in waiting. It was all very informal and somewhat hilarious. King George's poor health interrupted the long established family tradition of Christmas at Sandringham. The King and Queen stayed at Buckingham Palace, and we spent Christmas at home. The drawing room, newly paneled with Boughton oak to a design by Sir Albert Richardson, was a much admired when for the first time we used it for the estate party. There too we saw up in the new year, a year that was to be the first of 12 in which we rented Colin Mackenzie's house of Far in Inverness Shire for the summer holidays. We always wanted somewhere to stay in Scotland, and Far seemed just what we needed. It may not have been the most comfortable of houses, but it had enough bedrooms for us to squeeze in all our cousins and guests that we desired. Together with the grouse shooting and the trout fishing, it was suited in a beautiful Highland countryside. It had innumerable walks and sites for picnics, lovely woods to wander in, a stream running right up to the house, and a small island on the loch. A favorite expedition was to the Loch Ness, where we went in hopes of spotting the monster. We took my maid along with us one day. We gazed at the view before her, Highland cattle, the loch, the mountains, and beyond, and murmured in rapture. How lovely, just like the calendar. I could understand what she meant, though would not have described it that way myself. We had a tutor for our sons, whom we loved dearly. He came each year for the summer holidays. He was a great help, as we knew he would keep a watchful eye on the boys and their friends if my husband and I were away from home. We enjoyed a wonderful feeling of blissful anticipation when the day arrived for us to set off from Barnwell, from the north. A vast bus, which we used for luggage in Australia, it went ahead, and it was driven by Prater, our chauffeur. It had guns, fishing rods, our staff, and a Labrador. We followed in the rows, driven by my husband, who hated being driven by anyone else and only let it happen if absolutely necessary. Packed inside would be Mr. Robson, the tutor, the two boys, and three Australian terriers. And following behind was Amos, who was the valet. Mr. Amos and their little boy. We usually broke our journey with a night at Drumlanrig with my sister-in-law in Melrose. I think these Scottish holidays were the happiest days of all, for which I shall forever remember and be thankful of. My brother Billy and sister-in-law Rachel invariably came to stay with their two youngest children. Among others who came regularly were Princess Alice, the Countess of Athlone, and Prince Henry's sister, the Princess Royale. The Princess Royale, in particular, she much enjoyed an expedition to visit the shops in Inverness, and would spend ages wandering around Woolsworth, all on her own, till one or the other of us was sent to collect her. The tradesmen in Inverness would frequently give parcels of meat, bread, etc., to the bus driver to put on the top of the wall as it passed by our gate, and they were always there when someone went to collect them in the evening. The local people were very honest, and so apparently were the passers-by. They would not remain there for long nowadays. The only remotely official event we attended was the local flower show or the local fete. The Princess Royale usually managed to win the three-legged race with one of the children, and she always gave away the prizes at the flower show. Mr. Trotter, the redoubtable organizer of the event, donated these. She owned a large garden nearby, and the prize giving ceremony inevitably meant the Princess Royale was handing back to all the prizes, and they consisted mostly of half crowns, and she had given them in the first place. Princess Alice, for her part, had a habit of going out and picking the most poisonous looking mushrooms, which she would then unsuccessfully try to make us eat. The Princess Royale was likely to return from such forays with her pockets weighed down with stones and shells. These she would subsequently put in bowls filled with water to bring out the colors. One morning, William and the chauffeur's little boy persuaded Princess Alice to take them for a walk. On the way back, they realized they were going to be late for lunch, and accordingly, they tried to take a shortcut, which landed them up against a high deer fence. Looking around, the boys soon found a dry ditch that allowed them to wriggle underneath the wire. That sounds like boys. They then inveigled Princess Alice into doing the same thing, and one of them pushing and the other pulling. She thought it was a great joke. Prince Henry, he would be out most days shooting with neighbors, or often, of course, at Far itself. He also liked fishing. On one occasion, we went up to Beaufort Castle, home of the Lovets, which that summer was lent to a rich American lady, Miss Hammond. Prince Henry fished while we sat around the river bank, but he caught nothing. Miss Hammond, however, with commendable tact and foresight, had bought a salmon from the fishmonger for just such an emergency, and had already put it on the boot of her car. We also ordered a plateful of roast chicken, sausage, and bacon to be given to each of the Australian terriers. This we did not realize was happening all too little too late, and much to our annoyance, they sicked it all up on the way home. Yeah, that's not. Prince Henry also liked walks and picnic expeditions. One of the greatest excitements of the early days at Far was to go and watch John Cobb testing his speedboat on Loch Ness in preparation for his attempt to become the fastest man on the water. Luckily, we were not there the morning he was killed when the boat blew up. One of the most memorable visits by a celebrity to Far was paid by Paul Getty, the oil billionaire. He was staying with our friends, the Maxwells, and arrived in an enormous car to join us for lunch with the Guns. He could hardly have been dressed more inappropriately for a rough day on the hill, wearing an almost white cotton suit and long pointed black shoes, and was already blue with cold when he arrived. Feeling sorry for him, I insisted he wear Prince Henry's stocking cap, which he did with some relief. I told him this car was too big for the hill road and he would have to come in mine. This also seemed agreeable enough for him, but he winced when it was revealed that I was to be the driver, and did so even more perceptibly when I hit a rock on the side of the road, hidden by a clump of heather. Once out of the car, I forgot to warn him with the greenest moss was also the wettest moss, and he was soaked to his knees before he made the discovery for himself. At lunch, he appeared to have no idea how to sit around, and perched himself gingerly on the picnic basket, trying to think of something to say to break one's particular heavy silence. My nephew, Walter Scott, then a schoolboy, observed, "My stars say this is a day of financial gains." One of the guests produced a 2-bob piece, but Mr. Getty disregarded the ensuing giggles. He stayed for tea at the house, where he was delighted to discover from his pedometer that he had managed to walk 1.25 miles in that day. He celebrated by eating a whole ginger cake, remarking he'd never tasted anything half so good. When he left, I asked him for the cape, which he was still wearing. Apologetically, but with some reluctance, he handed it over. One afternoon, an expedition which appeared on the map to be enjoyable and by no means difficult was to cause me a half an hour or more of great anxiety. We set off that morning for a picnic lunch at one of our favorite lochs. Feeling energetic, the boys and I decided it would be a splendid idea to climb up over the ridge behind us and down the far side. Meanwhile, Prince Henry, with the Princess Royale, chose to drive around and wait for us on the other side at an appointed farm. Our climb looked no distance on the map, but for Richard and me, it turned out to be a long and exhausting trek. We started off at the foot of a small burn tumbling down the mountainside. There was a sheep track on either side. I elected to take the easy one, winding up the grassy slope. The more adventurous William decided he'd climb the steep straight one up through the stony rocks. I told him to wait for us at the top, but on arriving, we found no William. Ahead of us lay a long expanse of boggy ground, and on our right, a long, dark, deep tarn with high, sheer rocks on its farther side. I half dragged, half carried Richard through the squishy moss and peat hags. On reaching the far side, there was still no sign of William to be seen. I really felt alarmed and imagined him falling over those steep cliffs into the tarn below. Hot and exhausted, we eventually came to where the hill sloped to the valley below. Much to my relief, there was the road, the farm, and the waiting car. Some distance away to the right was a small figure stepping swiftly down the mountainside and almost there. Needless to say, it was William, who had found a better, firmer track on the mountain top, well away from the tarn and the bog we had struggled. Though our roundabout way, I felt furiously angry with him for giving me such anguish, and then I remembered my mother's anger when my sister and I were nearly drowned at Seascale, and for the first time realized why. The highlights of the holiday was always the week we spent at Balmoral. Once again, Richard was in a great state of agitation on the day we left Balmoral to return to Bar. Apparently, Princess Anne, then 5 or 6 years old, had burst into his room that morning as he was packing, seized his dirk, and saying, "I've always wanted to do this," and had plunged into the eider down right to the mattress. I told him he should have explained this to the Queen or the housekeeper, otherwise they would all think he'd done it. "No," he said resolutely, "I couldn't tell on her." "Isn't that nice, Prince Richard?" "Oh, no, I couldn't tell on her." Prince Charles and Prince Anne would visit us at Barnwell from time to time. When bicycling was still a novelty for them, they found it exciting to bicycle through the ford in the village. The stream was about 3 inches deep, and they could make quite a splash. With them would come Nana Lightbody, no doubt delighted to be again with her previous charges and having an opportunity to meet many old friends. In the autumn of 1949, I visited the Army of Occupation and various Air Force hospitals in Germany. Proceeding to Vienna to pay a call on my North Hampshire regiment, all that time Vienna was divided between the Allies and the Russians. The airport was in the Russian zone, so I had to travel through the Russian-controlled part of the city to reach the British zone. All along the route, the Austrians rushed from their houses or waved from the windows, blowing kisses and deliberately infuriating the Russians by the warmth of their welcome. Just how furious they were was revealed a day later when news reached us that our route to a sundowner at the officers' mess had been blocked the last minute by the breakdown of a Russian train on a level crossing. They had done it on purpose. Of course, and thus succeeded in making us take an 8-mile detour and arrive late. The regiment were quartered in barracks built by Hitler, which was greatly superior to most of ours in England. The 1950s marked the Golden Jubilee of Nairobi, capital of Kenya, and to mark the occasion, we were sent out with magnificent mace to confer the status of the city on the town by the grant of a royal charter. On the way, we stopped in Cairo so that Prince Henry would present King Farouk with a field marshal baton, which was the only honor King George VI could think of as being suitable. It was not a great success, however, because the king was rather put out to find no uniform went with it. As he was decidedly strange shape by then, it could have been asking a lot of any tailor to make such a thing without a fitting. Still, he soon swallowed his pride and asked us to a tea of sickeningly sweet sticky cakes. Prince Henry, not having at all a sweet tooth, found this a great ordeal. The tea finally was over. The king asked us if we would like to see his dogs. He appeared to be under the impression that there was nothing Prince Henry would rather do. Prince Henry was fond of his own dogs, it's true, but not particularly interested in other people's. However, we tried to appear enthusiastic and proceeded to follow the king on a tour of some dismal and smelly kennels, where a half-dozen dispirited Alsatians languished in the heat. In Kenya, we began our visit traveling around, staying at Deloraine, and meeting many old friends. The day of the charter ceremony happened to be Prince Henry's 50th birthday, and the crowd touched us greatly by bursting into a spontaneous rendering of Happy Birthday, which echoed down the street. William went to boarding school for the first time in the autumn of Wesley House. William went to boarding school for the first time in the autumn to Wesley House Broadstairs. We were relieved to hear that he had settled down and enjoyed his journey to Broadstairs, the first he had taken by train since coming to England. Much of the agitation of the masters in charge, he disappeared at one moment, only to be discovered eventually on the luggage rack. Apparently, he had done it for a bet. We always went to visit the boys at half-term, for which the headmaster, Mr. Boyce, would kindly lend us his house. Richard followed William when the time came, and both subsequently passed their common entrance exams into Eton. Our boys were brought up with as little fuss and formality as we could contrive. As a child, William was keen on riding, but Richard could not be bothered to put on breeches and a cap and preferred his bicycle. I used to take them hunting occasionally, which I think they enjoyed. Certainly, it was less worrying for them than it was for me, with William going one way and Richard another. We decided not to buy hunters again and kept one stableman only to look after our 2 polo pony hacks and the children's ponies. He had been with my husband before we married and remained with us until he was too old to work any longer. Prince Henry and I would ride around the estate every morning whenever possible, and often the boys would come with us. Prince Henry also took great interest in teaching them to shoot. He was happy in joining them in outdoor occupations. They did croquet, they did bonfires, there were picnics, cricket, leaving me to do most of the indoor entertaining like reading stories. Cricket matches were always a tradition of the early days of August. There's an annual fixture with our neighbors, the Wolseley Lewis under 13s, and it usually ended up with both teams in the swimming pool. There was also an annual Barnwell-Sandringham estate match in which Prince Henry liked to play. The nines consisted of all ages, young and old. There were quite a lot of boys in the vicinity at the time, and with the help of a few of William or Richard's school friends, we usually had little difficulty in mustering sides. With everyone growing at the different rates they were, inevitably some shocks from year to year. One summer, the Barnwell policeman's little boy missed a match because he had measles, but next year he was still eligible, so we invited him again. A 6-foot-tall youth appeared, who turned out to be him, and proceeded at great speed to bowl out the little boys on the opposing side of the horror and consternation of their parents. We were very embarrassed and frantically signaled to William to take him off, but he paid not the slightest attention. Luckily, there were no casualties. The children's early school years were comparatively quiet for us. We both enjoyed country life, and at Barnwell found plenty to occupy us in those moments when we were free of public obligation. I always wrote my own speeches, but Prince Henry seldom did, and he disliked delivering them just as much. He was the sort of person whom it was difficult to get started in time. He would never be ready. He fussed over details, looking for papers and remembering last-minute instructions for this. Even visiting the boys at Eton, we would sometimes arrive an hour late. I would be in agonies on the journey, thinking of them, waiting forlornly, wondering what had become of us. No doubt they knew perfectly well. Well, this aligns with some of King George's frustrations. He would get frustrated with him about some of his disorganization. So this quite aligns with some of those frustrations that he had. But anyways, some events were a particular strain for Prince Henry, and in consequence for me, perhaps most of all, the trooping of the color. With an uncomfortable uniform and a horse, which probably hated the elaborate harness and trappings, many occasions, such as agriculture shows, we used to attend together. Prince Henry particularly enjoyed race meetings, which held personal memories for him. Aldershot races and the Grand Military Cup, which is now run at Sandown. After he died, I presented a trophy in his memory to be raced for a Sandown at the Grand Military Meeting. At Barnwell, however, he was busy and contented. There was plenty to do. When we bought the manor, most of the land was farmed by tenants, but because of the anticipated difficulty of dealing with their demands while we were in Australia, we sold most of the estate. Rather to our surprise, it fetched a larger sum than we had originally paid for the entire property. On our return, we started to build a dairy and a farm buildings, but the land we had retained was not large enough to be economical. So the proceeds of the sale of the tenant farms, we began to buy back untenanted land near Barnwell as it came up for sale, and thus it increased our holdings to an estate today of 5,000 acres. The farm was run in a somewhat casual way by present standards and probably never paid, but this was as much a reflection of the times of anything. Prince Henry always improved and modernized as best he could, but the organization was less professional in those days than it is now. We shared a land agent with Boughton and only retained a clerk at Barnwell to handle the accounts. Today, the farm is run as a business. A firm audits the accounts. We have a resident manager and even an expert who visits us once a month to advise Richard on matters of overall policy. In the early days, we used to employ a number of nice old men who continued to do the odds and ends of lighter work till the days they had died. That sort of person does not appear to exist any longer. While Prince Henry concentrated on the farm, I kept an eye on the garden. He worked there too for much of the time, especially cutting down bushes, but only if I was there with him. On his own, he would get bored. We enjoyed collecting antiques for the house and doing the rounds of the London shops in search of his favorite nesso, miniature elephants and sporting prints, pictures of books. His favorite bookseller never much appreciated my coming, as I would question some of his prices, whereas Prince Henry paid whatever was suggested without murmur. Oh goodness, I would say, we can't afford that. We really can't. The bookseller would give me a withering look, and then the next time he might say casually, "Oh, by the way, I found a rather less expensive copy of that book we were looking at on your last visit," and produce what was probably the exact same volume for our inspection. I'm going to stop right here.